Let's see. It says connecting. Live. Hello. We're starting this broadcast. We're waiting for people to join before getting into it. Just a few minutes. Let me make sure this thing is going out. There we have some people coming. Hello, thank you for joining. We're just waiting a minute or two before getting this off. The thing about Substack is that it's never on time. It's a little bit Mediterranean in that way. You say send this at 3 p.m. and then it just doesn't.
It's just like
Italians,
Italian and Turks.
Yeah, no problem.
Designed for us.
Yeah.
This will be in English. Don't worry, everybody can speak Italian, but we're keeping this broadcast in English, and it will be available after the broadcast as well. I think I fixed the tech issues that stopped me from sharing it immediately afterwards. So, yeah, it's not sending. I'm going to send it manually. The invitation to join this, basically. Mashallah, now we're there. I'm guessing you're getting notifications. So, I'll start, and then we'll see how it goes, because don't want to wait too long. How long do you want to go? That's the only question I didn't ask you. How much time do you have?
I have time, no worries.
Yeah, we love the topic.
Okay, let's aim for an hour 15, maybe, because it's 3 people. I want to make sure that you both get to talk.
Mhm.
Yeah, let's go. Okay, so we're going to start. Thank you for joining us. My name's Diego Cupolo. I'm the editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap. I'm based in Ankara. Today I'm talking to 2 Italian analysts, Riccardo Gasco and Samuele Abrami. Riccardo is a foreign policy program coordinator at IstanPol Institute and a doctoral researcher at University of Bologna. Samuele is a Mercator-IPC Fellow and researcher at the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. They are also the hosts of Cose Turche News podcast. It's an Italian podcast on Turkish news, Cose Turche podcast. Highly suggest listening to it if you listen to, if you can understand Italian. It's the best Italian source on Turkish news. Do you even have competitors? That's my first question.
No, we
Not
were
at all.
pioneers.
So we're talking to the right people about Italian-Turkish ties. You're the leading experts on this domain, and you have Cose Turche News podcast. So glad to join up in our forces, Turkey Recap, Cose Turche. We're talking today because President Erdoğan was in Rome yesterday. He met with Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and there was a 4th intergovernmental summit between Italy and Turkey. This is part of a series of big meetings between the countries that basically oversee bilateral trade and different kinds of cooperation, including defense, security, pretty much everything. To give some background, intergovernmental summits between Turkey and Italy have been going on since 2008. The first one was in 2008, then we had one in 2012. The last one was in 2022, and yesterday we had the 4th one. So there's a lot to cover. We're going to try to get to all of it. One interesting point is that Imamoglu and his arrest was not mentioned yesterday during the summit, but the summit focused mostly on positive bilateral partnerships, pragmatic relations. Italy and Turkey have a long history and understanding of cooperation and, let's say, shared regional interests. and Riccardo and Samuele will detail those. And yesterday, we also saw some developments in defense cooperation following fairly significant agreements between Italian and Turkish defense firms. Leonardo and Baykar are looking to create drones and other kinds of arms to serve European markets and beyond. This is a first kind of cooperation that we're seeing since the many different developments that have been unfolding globally since the Trump took over in Washington for the second term. Basically, Europe needs to focus on its own defense, and we're kind of seeing the spearhead of that with Italian and Turkish defense cooperation. Maybe this could be the beginning of what Europe's response is to Washington's unreliability or wavering messaging, let's say. So there's a lot to talk about. I'll just get to the questions. Samuele, let's start with you. What happened yesterday in the summit?
Well, yeah. Thank you so much, firstly, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for us as followers of Turkey Recap since the beginning of our very short but vividly careers following Turkish dynamics and socio-political things. So it's a pleasure for us. It's also a big pleasure talking about Italy and Turkey relations. So there's also a personal side of the thing, I would say, right, that links us to Turkey as well. So basically what we're talking about is an intergovernmental meeting that showcases basically what we already knew about the status of Turkey-Italian relations, in the sense that we know the Turkey-Italian relations, despite all the ebbs and flows about, let's say, linked to politics, they're getting along well. The two countries, they've been getting along well in the last years, despite what happened a decade ago with the Arab uprising, despite what happened in Libya, despite what happened in the Eastern Mediterranean and whatsoever. This is because basically there is a very important economic commercial driver of these relations, because the numbers have been increasing. We're now talking about 32 billions of exchange. Usually it was much more balanced. Now it's a bit skewed in favor of Italy, but still, I mean, we're talking about numbers that have been increasing. So you know that when we're talking about bilateral relations, in the end, when we're talking about money, money creates a venue for keeping these relations on the pragmatic way and not very much talking about values on anything that could undermine the bilateral relations. That's why, in the end, it's from a diplomatic point of view or from a pragmatic point of view, it's understandable that especially a government like the Meloni one didn't mention anything about Imamoglu's arrest. And that's quite obvious, right? We might imagine the reasons why. And so what makes this intergovernmental meeting a bit different from the others is the geopolitical context and the timing of this meeting. Because some followers might also remember that the previous one in 2022 followed a very tense period between Italy. It was short, but it was the time when back then Prime Minister Mario Draghi referred to Erdogan as a dictator. They were not meeting in person, but I mean, in a conference, he made it big, let's say. But then
just one time.
Yep, yeah, just one time, and then he basically he was forgiven by Erdogan, because also Draghi realized in the end that the importance of economic relations, should have kept the two countries on the track of pragmatism and cooperation anyway, despite all the known convergence on values and the way the two countries and some leaders might see the world. So this meeting is a bit different. Also, the one in 2022 actually happened right after the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that was the trigger, for example, for Mario Draghi to refrain from criticizing Erdogan again after calling him a dictator, and having this meeting that highlighted basically the importance of the two countries' cooperation from, of course, an economic perspective, but also from let's say, the perspective of having two middle powers, or however we want to call in the Mediterranean area, representing basically some sort of protectors for the Mediterranean shore of NATO. And also Draghi at that time realized the importance of Turkey as a mediator in the conflict, because since the very beginning of the conflict, Turkey wanted to play a role in that sense. But now we are talking about also the fact that Turkey could represent a significant player for what we're talking about now, which is the creation, or at least the attempt to create a strategic autonomy for the European Union, a new strategic architecture, a new military architecture of the EU. And here comes the question of could Turkey help the European Union to build such a new architecture? How can we integrate Turkey? How can we rely on a country like Turkey that was also seeking its own strategic autonomy lately? And here comes the thing that probably then Riccardo has more expertise than I do, the deal between Baykar and Leonardo, because it represents basically a bilateral deal, but between two NATO countries, but between a country like Italy that belongs to the EU and a country that doesn't belong to the EU. And here the question is, could it represent a springboard for new venues of cooperation into, let's say, within a broader framework at the European level and not just at the bilateral level?
Yeah. Riccardo, you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would start by highlighting a few differences between what characterized Turkey-Italian relation prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the second administration of Donald Trump, because the geopolitical conjunction, the geopolitical environment in which Italian-Turkish relations were taking place before was more of a peaceful environment in which, for instance, we didn't have the Russian threat at the door of Europe. And we didn't have the US presidency that was directly threatening the European defense by even making some very awful remarks, saying that the United States would leave NATO, and that even before he took the presidency, that he would have let Russian attack basically European countries if they were not going to reach the 2% spend in defense. So, of course, giving these evolving and fragmented geopolitical environment, which is characterized by a high level of insecurity, relations took a different turn. And they started to change, exactly as Samuele was saying, in 2022. And in my understanding, in 2022, one of the foundational agreements that then allowed the two countries to sign defense deals was a deal, sort of an understanding on the management of information, like classified informations related to defense industry. I think that was one of the foundational acts that then allowed the two countries to then, for instance, before Baykar, I will explain this in details later, but Baykar to basically buy the Piaggio Aerospace, and then the joint venture between Baykar and Leonardo. So what we are seeing right now, I think we should look at this from two perspectives. The first one is the European perspective, in which the European, like in Brussels, people are very much acting in a sort of an emergency way. And when you're acting into an emergency way, of course, you give priority to pragmatism over values, as Samuele also mentioned. And how do you do that? You do that by sort of giving preferences to bilateral deals. Why do you do so? Because, of course, acting within a multilateral frameworks in which countries they need to agree like 100% on everything makes things very slow, very complicated, and doesn't allow the European Union to act in a very pressing geopolitical environment which is characterized by insecurity. So, wrapping it up, like what really changed in my understanding is that the geopolitical priorities took over the sort of the foundational values of the European Union, which are also the foundational value of the Italian government. Let's not forget that Italy is one of the founding members of the European Union, of course. But also, I think there is another factor, which is the one that we are sharing the same shores of the Mediterranean. In Turkey, we are always referring to it as the Akdeniz culture, right? So, like the culture of the Mediterranean, which creates quite a lot of affinity. And I think we can talk later about, for instance, what characterize like relations from a cultural and historical and, for instance, like archaeological perspective. But these are the elements that I think allowed Turkey and Italy to deepen their cooperation by recognizing that they share strategic interests in the wider Mediterranean, and that the only way to sort of find solutions and find ways to counter the Russian threat is to give rise to this sort of partnership. Of course, like values are not considered in this. Imamoglu was not mentioned at all, other than few opposition politicians that raised their voice. But what we've seen is Italy and Turkey choosing the pragmatic way at the moment.
And just to put this in context, how would you frame Italian-Turkish relations, this century? And how do you frame Erdogan-Meloni relations on a personal level?
Yeah, if I can start with, I would say that Turkey-Italian relations, they work out despite leaders, I would say, because of the reasons that Riccardo just mentioned. Also, like some sort of unmaterial elements in the end, they play a role in politics, right? And because like whenever you cannot or you struggle to reach an agreement, in the end it's easier to do diplomacy through already existing channels. So if there is a non-existent channel at the highest political level, but in the end you already have cooperation in other, let's say, fields like education, culture, sports, right? Because, for example, 2032, Italy and Turkey will also organize the European Football Cup. It's small things maybe to the political public, but in the end, to the general public, it's things that matter. It's things that help, for example, also the Italian audience to be reminded of the fact that in the end, Turkey is not, let's say, a super Middle Eastern country as sometimes it's represented in the news, but it's also a country that is always knocking at the doors of Europe. And it's also actually super integrated into many European, not just political infrastructures and architectures, but also, for example, when we're talking about things like football, Turkey is also super integrated, right, in the European leagues. Turkey is quite present also when it comes to cultural activities, to museums, to archaeological exchange, and so on. So this is the basis on which leaders can build mutual trust, right, in Turkey and Italy. What makes, I think, personal relations between Meloni and Erdogan different from the previous decades in which, Erdogan was already there, but not Meloni, is the fact that at the same time, they share and not share some visions of things. Because Riccardo and I were just exchanging some messages before the podcast about the tweets that Meloni was making when she was at the opposition. And they were super vocal against everything that Erdogan was saying or doing. They were against the fact that Erdogan was trying to Islamicize Europe, that Erdogan was, just using the refugee card to get something from Europe or anything for granted, that he had an upper hand towards European Union and so on. So there was both a cultural and a strategic divide in Meloni's mindset towards Turkey. But what today makes a difference towards the positive side of their relation is the fact that in the end they share the way of doing politics, in the sense that they both belong to the big conservative family. Of course, conservatism, the word, they do not necessarily share everything, but at least they, especially with this new Trumpism, right? I would call it. It's like a new way of doing politics. It's even beyond firm ideologies. It's even beyond a way of conceiving what being a conservative party or a conservative leader is. It's more a way of being transactional without having to justify it. It's a way of holding, let's say, of giving more importance to personal ties, sometimes even bypassing official channels. It's not something that happens in the case of Meloni much, but, for example, also the case of this intergovernmental meeting is quite telling, because it was supposed to take place 10 days ago, basically more than 10 days ago. It was postponed, and the official reason, and also I would say that the reasonable reason, is the fact that Meloni had to meet with Donald Trump at the White House. And that is quite telling also about the role that Meloni is now trying to play in this, let's say, power vacuum within the European Union, in which we have Germany that is no longer the Germany of Merkel, a leader like Merkel. We have France that, it's caught between different fires from the political level, and then we know the French position against Turkey and whatsoever. And so Meloni is trying to do this balancing act between, in terms of keeping the transatlantic relations on track, but in a way that represents the way of doing politics of the conservatives rather than the way politicians before Meloni were trying to conceive.
Riccardo, did Meloni make any strange faces during her meeting yesterday? She's very famous for her faces.
She is, but I haven't seen any memes coming up yet. So I think yesterday, like, it was pretty, I would say, like, sort of institutional, very much institutional setup. And there were no, like, sort of any, I would say, I would call them funny moments, which we are used to see whenever Meloni meets some foreign leaders. And we used to see also between Erdogan and Meloni before, which I wanted to add to what Samuele was saying, that it is very telling also the fact that Meloni and Erdogan, they met between 8 to 10 times in the last 2 years, which is an unbelievable amount of times for two heads of state. Like to meet this frequently. Well, that's true. There were many multilateral like meetings and gatherings, but they were able to meet like aside of those meetings all the time. So that means that there is definitely a very strong political willingness to enhance and to make ties between Turkey and Italy stronger in this specific moment that we are living. Whether this is sustainable or not, and whether this is sustainable not only for Italy but for the European Union, is an open-ended question which we can discuss further.
Yeah, I'm wondering how was this viewed in public? Before we went live, Riccardo was talking about news coverage of the summit. What about, were there protests? Were there any? What was the reaction in Italy from politicians and from the public?
So I think this is very interesting because Samuele was mentioning that the summit was supposed to happen on the 17th of April. Then Meloni flew to Washington to meet with President Trump. And at the time, like there were no official reason given by both governments. Like they just said through their sort of business associations that the meeting was postponed. And the opposition was hoping, in a way, in Italy, that the reason why the meeting was postponed it was because of Imamolo's arrest, and that it was not proper for a European leader to welcome President Erdogan with, you know, the national anthems and all, with the military sort of honor and the classic official welcoming that is given to foreign leaders. But as we are seeing, the reason was much more pragmatic. Probably Meloni, of course, gave precedence to meet with Donald Trump, and this is because of the tariffs. And I think this is another very interesting topic that is giving way to Turkish-Italian cooperation, because we saw that Turkey is not much hit, or will not be much hit by the tariffs that the Trump administration is going to implement, but Italy would be much more. So this is also giving new opportunities, opening new windows of opportunities for alternative partnership in which countries that are middle powers and they can somehow, they are contributing to global politics, but they don't have the actual weight to shape global politics. By coming together, they can sort of benefit from these geopolitical gaps, these power vacuums that are opening. We are seeing this from an economic perspective, from a defense perspective, but we are also seeing this in different geographical theaters. We could talk about Syria, we can move to Libya, and also the African continent, from the sub-Saharan Africa until the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. Those are very important areas of cooperation between Italy and Turkey, and those are areas in which Italy and Turkey are trying to do some sort of political experiment to expand their partnerships. That is very interesting to me. Coming back to your original question about the coverage, so we were talking before that I checked all the main newspapers and the first pages of the newspaper, and I mean, not a single newspaper in Italy put it, you know, with a big picture of Erdogan and Meloni shaking their hands and saying, you know, like, Italy had this wonderful meeting. We are gaining this, we are gaining that. It was mostly portrayed in an economic perspective by the main newspapers. Of course, there are articles on the newspaper, but I would say that we haven't seen like a wide coverage that would have been otherwise given, in my opinion, to any other leader that would have come for an intergovernmental summit of a full day with over 500 companies to Italy, you know, to sign 10 agreements, which we didn't mention yet, but these are 10 very important agreements and memorandum of understanding that will deepen the cooperation. So this was the media coverage. In terms of politicians, we've seen some voices coming up, and this is very much interesting, and it's also related to the Imamoglu's arrest, the mayor of Istanbul, because one of the most voicey political figure in Italy is Dario Nardella. Dario Nardella was the former mayor of Florence, and now is a European MP, and he has been sort of trying to highlight like the democratic backsliding and the oppression of the opposition in Turkey. He has been doing this at the Italian level by organizing demonstration at the European level as well. And we've seen some others like sort of criticism towards the Meloni government by Laura Boldrini. She's very important MP by the Democratic Party. We've seen this from Nicola Fratoianni, who is another important MP from a far left party, I would say, like more on the left spectrum of the political divide. But for instance, again, like we haven't seen any sort of criticism, of course, from Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Northern League, which also used to be, like Meloni, a very harsh critics of Erdogan in the past. Like Samuele was recalling some of those tweets, and this morning I was checking them, and it's kind of funny now that we are talking about like a leader that is shaking Erdogan's hand, smiling and calling him to wish him happy birthday, when like 3-4 years ago, she was calling him an Islamist that was going to conquer Europe, like following the dictates of the Ottoman Empire, right? So we are talking about a very complex and different situation. And one other factor which I think is important here is the institutionalization of leadership whenever they get power. Like this is not only visible in Turkey-Italian relations and the way in which Meloni behaved with Erdogan, but it's visible in any other kind of behavior that Meloni has been sort of acting and moving forward since she became the prime minister of Italy. Like there is a striking difference between the electoral campaign, what she was saying, what she was supporting, and the things that she started to say when she took power. Well, we know this is part of an institutionalization process, which is very important, because when you are the head of state, of course, you need to be driven by the national interest somehow. But Meloni is coming from a very conservative background, a neo-fascist background. I wouldn't call Meloni at all like a fascist leader, but there are elements within her constituency that are still directly linked with neo-fascist ideology. What she's been trying to do, and I think she's been pretty successful in this, at least at the international level in conducting foreign policy, is to get rid of those elements and to try to strike a balance between sort of anti-EU sentiment that she was supporting before, anti-Americanism that she was supporting before, to a more pragmatic approach. Why? Because there are this power vacuum, both at the international level and both at the European level, that Meloni, given her strong leadership at home, because we are talking about a solid majority in the parliament at the moment. And this is something also that is very interesting for Italy, because, you know, we are very used to have coalition governments, which are very weak and they change, the prime minister is changing and stuff. But right now they seem very much, you know, sort of convinced, and they have the willingness to bring this to the end of the term, which is giving her quite a lot of power, both at the EU level and at the international level, as we are seeing Trump, Erdogan, sort of also, you know, like trying to create this dialogue between different actors.
Yeah, and just to ask Samuele, I don't know if you saw signs of any coverage of protests against Erdogan. I know when I go to Italy, I see a lot of graffiti against the Turkish government. It seems like it's a specific ideology, often leftist. Does that actually materialize in protests?
Yeah, like in this case, I mean, in these days around the meeting, nothing happened. And I was reading right before our meeting now here an Italian article saying that the Italian government, I mean, both governments made everything to prevent anything like that to happen. For example, even the journalists were, I think, just 10 Turkish and 10 Italian journalists invited. And it's super relevant, the fact that they were not allowed to make questions during the meeting. So this was basically meant from both sides to keep it super institutional, the highest institutional level, in the sense that you just shake hands, you sign a memorandum of understanding, and you do not really question anything that revolves around bilateral or even, let's say, all the geopolitical challenges that might affect, right, the two countries. Because, yeah, we said they cooperate, but they also operate in a very sensitive environment in Libya, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in which finding finding a balance is not always interesting. And about also the Imamoglu case, I would say that had the meeting happened before, we would have been talking about a very different thing, probably, in terms of also protests, dissidents in the streets, I don't know, welcoming Erdogan in a different way, in a more, in a less visible way, I would say. Because, I mean, the topic of Imamoglu's arrest was quite present in Italian media, unexpectedly, I would say. But I think it's related to the fact that, I mean, the level of protest, especially in the first days, the level of violence in the first days of the protest could not be avoided, right? To be mentioned
Overlooked.
in any exactly overlooked in any media. But the fact that the meeting is has taken place in a very different environment, also for the protests that in Turkey basically they're not fading, but of course the way of protesting that we saw right after the arrest of Imamoglu is not here anymore, right? Because we mostly just have students and some weekly meetings, but we are far from what we saw in the very first day. So also the domestic environment of Turkey helped basically this meeting to be successful in a sense, or at least it helped Italy to easily avoid taking any risk in this sense. And of course, whenever you see then the numbers of economy and also the journals, the newspapers are giving priority to those numbers, in the end, it's automatic to somehow forget, at least within the public opinion, what happened a month ago. Because in the end, Turkey is on the news in Italy, but also in Europe, just whenever something bad happens. And then if something good, like the meetings we had yesterday, happens, well, yeah, okay, it's good numbers. And it's like another deal, like the ones we do with Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. So it's pragmatism. We need money, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's go to defense and the recent agreements. Yesterday, I wrote an article about this, but you also, both of you, co-authored an analysis on possible collaboration with Turkey for strategic defense in Europe. It's for IPC, right?
Yeah, the Istanbul Policy Center, yeah.
Yeah, it's titled Europe's Defense Awakening and its Strategic Partners. Any place for Turkey, question mark. Highly recommend reading it. It's probably the reason we're talking today, and what's driving a lot of the relations too, because in the background to this formality and all this political discussion, there's also very real developments in defense cooperation between Baykar and Leonardo, which is Italy's biggest defense firm. And Baykar, everybody knows, is Turkey's big drone manufacturer here. Basically, they're looking to make a joint venture. And from what I understand from talking to experts on this, is that Baykar has the drones, and Leonardo has the different sensors and digital, basically like AI and different technologies that can be attached to these drones. So it looks like a very advantageous venture for both of them. And then they can use, let's say, a more or a souped up, I don't know how to say it in a formal way, a Baykar drone with more technology on it. And basically, they can market this to new countries in Europe and also in Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, where both companies already have established markets. So this also comes after Baykar acquired Italy's Piaggio Aerospace, which is a company that is very old in Italy and I guess was having financial troubles. But that also gives them IP and different access to Italian technology, including the manufacturing of some compartments for the F-35 program, right? So this really puts Turkey at the center of some Western defense architecture. What's driving this partnership, specifically between Italian firms and Turkish firms? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go. So, so a few things before, like just to understand the broader picture of what made this defense cooperation possible. Before Imamoglu's arrest, we were basically observing one of the, I would call it like one of the biggest rapprochement between Turkey and the European Union under different perspectives. We have seen like a lot of meetings. There was a diplomatic flurry of people going to Ankara and also Turkish officials going to Brussels in a public or unpublic way. But there was a big like movement going on between Turkey and the EU. And one of the factors that I think like made this possible, rather than the war in Ukraine and the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was Syria. And why do I mention Syria? Because like Syria showed that Turkey, in a way or in another, we could discuss forever whether Turkey could be considered a winner, or what like sort of like practical advantages and what will be the future role of Turkey in Syria could be discussed forever. But let's say that from a diplomatic perspective, now what we're seeing is that if European countries, Italy as well, they want to participate in the reconstruction of Syria, they have to pass from Turkey. There is no other way. There are no other actors, like, because you cannot pass through Russia, which also, I mean, like Russia's role in Syria, we've seen which kind of end had, and then it's very hard for the European countries also to pass through the Gulf. So Turkey is the only actor. Plus, let's put all of these into a broader framework of insecurity and fragmentations. So there are big pushes in this era to sort of restructure the liberal international order, what we call the liberal international order. So this world order that was basically born after the Second World War and that is based on multilateral institutions. There are big pushes to do so. And Turkey is a player that is sort of acting in the middle. We've seen Turkey wanting to join the BRICS, but we also cannot imagine Turkey surviving without the trade with the European Union. So Turkey needs to strike this balance between strategic autonomy and sort of dependence that it has with the European Union. But here, one of the, to my understanding, one of the most interesting factors is that if, like before the war in Ukraine, I would say, the direction of this dependency was more from, so Turkey was more dependent on Europe. Right now, we are seeing a shifting of this balance. I'm not saying that Europe is dependent on Turkey, because this would be way too, way exaggerated, but we are seeing a sort of a rebalancing of this relation. Because whenever we see like that Europe now needs security, they have to pass through Turkey. Whenever they want to invest in Africa now, they have to pass through Turkey. They cannot pass through China and Russia. And if they want to invest in Syria, they have to pass through Turkey, or Libya is the same thing. So these are the broader factors that gave rise, to this political momentum to strike defense deals. To keep it short, the most important thing for Turkey regarding the deal between Baykar and Leonardo is that Turkey would directly gain access to the European drone market, which is valued at $100 billion over the next 10 years, which is a massive market, and would also very much contribute to the lack of drone capabilities that we have in Europe, like, broadly speaking. So this is one of the most important things. And plus, the other deal that happened at the end of 2024 between Baykar and Piaggio Aerospace is giving Turkey the possibility to directly produce on the Italian soil, in the Italian, like it's located in Liguria region in the north of Italy. And this, combined with the partnership with Leonardo, is also making it very much easy. Like, I mean, it's making it possible, because it was impossible before, almost impossible. I mean, when it comes to high military technology, I'm not talking about armored vehicles or some other things, but we are talking about drones, so high military technology, to bypass the certification process that is extremely complicated for foreign actors to be able to market and to sell their products in the European Union. Having this joint venture at 50-50 is what is making this possible. And I think this is the most important development for Turkey. On the other hand, the deal is also very much complementing, because Turkey has the drone, Leonardo has the technology. Together, they can really fill the gap of European defense from the drone perspective. I mean, this wouldn't solve all the problems of from a defense perspective of the EU, but would definitely contribute to that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
here,
just to
sorry.
add before Samuele talks, there is a Eurodrone program, and you're a joint venture to produce basically autonomous flying drones for the continent, but it's just slow, it's over budget, it's not happening, and it seems like this is a faster way to provide drones to the continent, is another solution there. Samuele, sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
No, actually, it's exactly on the last point you were making, because we have challenges on these in the end, because we could hope, let's say, that these sort of bilateral relations in terms of defense between Italy and Turkey could represent a springboard for a wider European cooperation. But we are also seeing that there are challenges within European Union, and they somehow go back also to the challenges that European Union and Turkey already had before, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also about how differently European member states conceive European strategic autonomy. Because right after the publication or the discussions about the white paper of the Commission about defense, in the end, we already saw discussions within European Union about, yeah, what does it mean? How do we achieve it? And through which means? And should we ask for the help of non-EU countries? Because, yeah, initially, for example, what made actually Turkey visible for European defense objectives was the fact that Turkey was invited in London at the Coalition of the Willing meeting, right before the arrest of Imamoglu. And that was quite telling of the fact that the Coalition of the Willing meeting was held in a country that had left European Union, which is the UK. Also, Norway was invited, and also Turkey was invited. And that was actually when we were writing our paper, we were really thinking about this. Well, now we have European member states talking to EU-related countries, the so-called strategic partners. If you read the strategic compass that was published some years ago, we have this label of strategic partners. But when we look at the definition of how a strategic partner is conceived by the European Union, well, we do not really go super far, because they are sometimes referred as like-minded partners that share values and objectives with the EU. Well, in that case, Turkey doesn't really seem to fit. But then we also have another conception of the same label of strategic partner that is much more just referring to partners that share geopolitical challenges and objectives with the EU. And in that case, Turkey might really fit into the thing. And this is to say that countries like France, for example, they're pushing for a bi-European sort of way to achieve European strategic autonomy. And that would actually automatically imply excluding countries like the UK, excluding Turkey as well, because of course for countries like the UK would be easier probably to subscribe or to sign any sort of agreement, any binding agreement with the EU, because we already have a precedent, I would say, of super high integration, right, of the UK when it was a member state. But for Turkey, what creates issues, paradoxically, in my case, is also the fact that Turkey is a candidate member, is a candidate country for membership to the European Union, because that, on the one side, it provides the means for integration for Turkey, and we already saw the results of that. But on the other side, it links everything to something that is related to the EU membership. Cyprus is one thing that's at the end of any meeting, in the end, is mentioned as a cleavage between the two parties, right? Then we have also, for example, Turkey keeping asking about custom union renovation, modernization, visa liberalization. And so this is actually something that adds up to the lack of mutual understanding, of mutual trust. And so if we want to integrate an actor into the European Union, is a sort of do ut des, right? Is I give you, you give me something, but it should be based on a long-term framework that would allow to keep it sustainable in a long way. Otherwise, we are just talking about refugee deal 2.0, in which we have an issue. The EU is on the crisis mood, on the emergency mood, knocks at the door of Turkey, gives some money, gets something back, and that's it. But we do not really solve the problem at the roots, and we do not actually create a prosper environment that would really help even the European Union to find some real strategic autonomy from the transatlantic ally.
Yeah, yeah. We have a question from the audience. Basically, Red Sea security is a fundamental choke point for Italy and Europe. Do you see any cooperation between Italy and Turkey in managing Red Sea security. Basically, there's a big Turkish military presence in Somalia. Here in Ankara, I see Somalian students learning Turkish just to go back and work with Turkish soldiers in Somalia. So do you think that this is a place where Italy and Turkey can cooperate?
Riccardo, you want to go? I go.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when it comes to these areas, I think that cooperation takes a very different shape. And what I mean by that is that Turkey very much took over the Italian role in the Horn of Africa. But I was just reading a news before, like a few weeks ago, actually at the end of 2024, Italy even called China to help for the protection of the Red Sea and to help, to keep the security of these commercial choke points, which are, of course, fundamental to both the EU, Turkey, and the European Union trade policies. So there is definitely a way to enhance cooperation in those areas, but I do not see it happening in a military security perspective in a way that goes beyond the multilateral framework. I mean that it can take place between the task force of countries that are protecting the Red Sea, and there might be some cooperation there between Italy and Turkey, but in those areas, the cooperations between the two is mainly economic. We've seen these, like, I don't remember exactly, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. There was this Italian aid worker, we were also talking about it with Samuele today, and I think it's a testimony of the way in which Turkey-Italian relations evolved in the African continent, and she was kidnapped by Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And the Italian government tried to free her for, I don't remember exactly, but let's say 6 months. For a very long time, we've been trying to free her, but unsuccessfully. Then they decided to turn to Turkey and to seek for their help. And I think in a couple of weeks or maximum a month, she was brought home. And so this demonstrates that in those areas, Turkey is very much the security actor, the security provider, thanks through which European countries then can sort of further their cooperation and economic investments in those areas. And there was also a big debate, which is also quite tellingly, because Silvia Romano, this aid worker I was mentioning, when she was brought back to Italy, and the first picture of her that was published on the first page of Italian newspaper, she was wearing a bulletproof vest with the Turkish flag on it, because she was freed by the Turkish intelligence services. And this was the first picture available and the first picture that was published. And that sort of created quite a lot of backlash against Turkey. Like, this is the thing. And I just want to reconnect this briefly with what we were talking with you, Diego, before we started this live broadcast. That is that I've been going through quite a lot of Italian reports and Italian analysis on Italian foreign policy, both written in Italian and both written in English. And there is never a mention of Turkey in those reports. When we talk about Italian foreign policy in general, Turkey is never mentioned there. So I was questioning why. I mean, there is a clear reason why. So there is an emerging partnership that is sort of struggling to be institutionalized in a broader foreign policy perspective that takes into consideration the long term. So the Italian foreign policy has always been characterized by 3 basically circles, which are the Atlantic, the European, and the Mediterranean one. And the Mediterranean, of course, is the last one, which is right now actually just finding more way to emerge as a security and strategic areas, as we were mentioning till now. So this is also very interesting, because that's true. We are highlighting very positive developments between the two countries, but on the other hand, I think there is still quite a long way to go to be able to further integrate from an organic perspective, from a long-term perspective, Turkey into Italian's foreign policy view and perspective on the long term.
Yeah, and if we can jump in just about the Turkish presence in Africa and the way it operates, I would say that, as Riccardo said, as also you, Diego, mentioned, it's difficult to see cooperation on defense and military affairs in Africa, because military affairs for Turkey in Africa are actually a mean through which Turkey has access to bilateral relations with countries, right? Turkey has access to some countries, or for example, when we look at Turkish Airlines is flying literally everywhere, as the slogan, as the motto is saying, in Africa, right? It has no competitors in Africa, and that is quite telling about the so-called drone diplomacy. So the way Turkey presents itself in Africa, right? Despite the economic advantages or not that it can have from selling drones to countries like Ethiopia, not just in the Horn of Africa, right? This way of understanding relations with Africa allows Turkey to have access to political channels. You were mentioning the fact that Somali students are studying in Turkey. This is actually a channel through which Turkey is basically building the new African leaders. And these are leaders that will have a sympathy for Turkey, so that will allow Turkey to have primary access to political resources and to political channels and linkages in Africa, like no any other country probably have currently in certain scenarios. And also the way Turkey presents itself in discursive terms, right? There is like a term that our colleague and friend and some sort of mentor, I would say, Donelli, has forged, which is the Ankara consensus, and it's basically the way through which Ankara presents itself in Africa as a non-colonial power that is different from the Beijing consensus, which is actually built on the debt trap, or the Washington Western consensus, which is built on a neo-colonial understanding of Africa. So I would say that in that case, Turkey somehow has the upper end in African affairs, while for Italy, Africa is more like let's say an environment in which companies can operate, in which illegal migration can be prevented, but not in which Italy has the upper end as Turkey has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have another question about Balkans and possible cooperation there. I know Turkey's very active in the Balkans, and I also am looking at recent reports of Italy sending asylum seekers to Albania. I guess they're doing a deportation.
Yep.
I'm wondering if there's a crisscrossing of interests or areas for cooperation there on security and migration, just to open it up to different topics.
Yeah, I can say from my own experience, I think, and then I will leave the bulk of the thing to Riccardo. I did for my PhD research a couple of years ago some field trips to the Balkans, especially in Bosnia, and well, you see the Turkish presence there, and it's basically in line what I was just talking about, the Ankara consensus. I mean, Turkey in the end there is operating through channels that are not let's say, presenting Turkey as a security provider or anything like that, even though Turkey is actually selling drones and military equipment to many Balkan countries. But what is mostly visible of Turkey in the Balkans is the so-called soft power, right? Back then it was the Gulenist, basically having the upper hand in doing so, in operating in this sort of soft power environment through schools, to education center, vocational schools, whatever it was. But
Mosques.
also, yeah, mosque. We have the tika, right? We have the placa of tika on many buildings in Bosnian and Muslim countries in the Balkans. So it's mostly related to that. When it comes to security, Turkey is a security provider to Balkan countries, but I would say that security in relations to its relations with Italy is mostly linked to migration in that sense. And I would leave the floor to Riccardo for this.
Yeah, definitely. Like Italy has been trying to set up this sort of what they call relocation center for asylum seekers in Albania. This is part of the broader sort of political understanding and political ideas of the far right government that we have right now in Italy, which are seeing migrants as enemy. And there is no way to cut it short. This is the way in which they're being portrayed. And I think there is quite a lot of similarities here with the Turkish government. I mean, of course, in the Turkish case, we cannot really compare Turkey and Italy from a migrant perspective because we are talking about massively different numbers when it comes to asylum seekers in Italy and Turkey. But going back to these conservative sort of ideologies that we were mentioning before, which in Turkey encompasses both what we, using European ideological lenses, we say left and right, which they completely overlap. I will never forget when, like Kılıçdaroğlu was the candidate and Istanbul was full of Suriyeliler gidecek, like Syrians should go, right? So in Turkey is a bit different. Like it became a sort of a national security issue in the way in which it was portrayed, in a sort of a literally a weaponization of migration for political purposes. But they do share an understanding in terms of security, because Italy is getting quite a lot of migrants from the north of Africa. And the Balkan route, which is basically starting in Edirne and then going through the Balkans, was another source of illegal migration for Italy. And one of the things that I would highlight from yesterday, like press conference, was that Meloni basically thanked President Erdogan, for bringing down to zero. I don't know whether it's zero or not. It sounds like impossible, but well, to definitely reducing the number of illegal migrants that are crossing and coming to Italy through Turkey. So there is definitely an understanding, a convergence of interest in that sense. Meloni also came to Turkey before this meeting to specifically talk about migration routes. And there was a meeting that was held in Istanbul for that reasons. And few things more when it comes to the Balkan. I think the Balkans are a renewed area of interest for Turkey, because of course they were part and under the influence of the Ottoman Empire for many decades and years. And what we are seeing right now is a sort of, I would rather frame the Balkan as a way in which Turkey is experimenting, as Samuele was saying, a sort of a mix between soft and hard power. So a foreign policy that is basically driven by soft power, and then right after they can sort of insert some hard power instruments, such as selling drones to Croatia, Serbia, and then providing military equipment such as armored vehicles, for instance, to Albania and to other countries of the region. So historically speaking, I think that in a way or in another, Turkey was able to take over the Italian interest in that area. I mean, I think that in the past, those were areas which were much more under the influence of this, let's say, of some European countries, or under the influence of Italy. But right now, we are seeing that they're under the influence of Turkey. This very much fits into a broader framework of foreign policy when it comes to Turkey, for instance, which is the one sort of, I really discharge and do not agree with the Ottoman or neo-Ottoman lenses to read Turkish foreign policy, because I do not think that it gives a clear understanding of what Turkey is trying to pursue. But there is definitely a sort of a national interest to expand through soft powers in areas that were traditionally under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. This, I know it might sound contradicting, but it's taking place under completely different conditions, under completely different agreements. And we cannot say that Turkey is trying to take over territories from this country, which is often the narrative that is being portrayed in the Italian media, for instance. That's why I'm saying this, right? So it's an area like that needs to be sort of keep under consideration for further things. But Turkey definitely gave the upper ends in the Western Balkan compared to Italy, for instance.
Yeah. And since we're doing the 360 of the region, we should talk about Libya, I'm thinking. Turkey and Italy are both active or have interests in Libya. Can you somehow summarize it for people that know nothing about Italian and Turkish interests? Samuele, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course. Well, basically, when Turkey decided to intervene militarily, I would say, in support of the factions that were supported by the UN, basically saved also the interest of Italy indirectly. Because many people at the beginning saw Turkey's intervention as a destabilizer in the Libyan situation. But counterintuitively, I would say that in the end, Turkey helped to not stabilize, probably, or to find a peace agreement that we're not seeing, but at least to freeze the situation, to de escalate the level of violence and military confrontation that we were in see, right, at that time in 2020, when Turkey decided to intervene. And that actually signed, I would say, a starting point in which Italy realized that he had to cooperate with Turkey in the end if he wanted to either achieve something more or at least keep its own interest in Libya. And the main interest of Italy in Libya are basically linked to two things. One is migration, preventing illegal migration. And in that sense, we had also the Italian Interior Ministry basically funding Turkey's let's say, vessels or Turkish operated vessels in the Libyan army to prevent illegal migration. And the other side of this cooperation, of the interests of Italy in Libya, is the energy sector, because Eni, the main Italian player and one of the biggest international energy players, has huge interests and investments in Libya. And so also the region in which Turkey or Turkey-supported militias are and where and are operating are those areas that are heavily, let's say, of interest for Italy energy relations.
Let me add one short thing here, because I think there is also another convergence when it comes to Libya, and which is to counter Russian expansionism, basically. So Turkey and Italy were also aligned on this. We know that Russia has big interest in Libya and has also been trying to relocate from Syria to Libya after the fall of Assad. So it's one of the few places in which Russia is still keeping an important presence, a strategic presence in the Mediterranean, because it basically lost the military bases in Syria. So right now it's left only with Libya when it comes to meaningful sort of presence in the continent. So that is also another factor. This would open up another big topic, which is like the way in which Turkey-Italian relations plays out in the broader framework of Turkish-Russian relations, which I think is very interesting. And we've also seen this in Syria, for instance. But I leave it to that right now, because it would be very long to develop this.
Yeah. And questions are welcome. We'll try to start wrapping up shortly. I just wanted to bring this back to Europe, but at the end, while we're on this tour, we haven't talked about Syria or Israel. We just got a question about that. Does Italy have interest in either place, and does it align with Turkey, basically? Israel, Syria, Turkey, Italy. Can you
So
say anything about that?
absolutely, this is an interesting question, because we've seen Turkey's and President Erdogan's rhetoric, and I do not say rhetoric by mistake, because I think it's rhetoric when it comes to Israel, and it's narrative, it's foreign policy narrative. And there has been a moment in which there was a sort of a misalignment between Italy and Turkey on this, because of course Italy cannot use the same strong rhetorical words that President Erdogan is using against Israel, and for obvious historical reasons. And so that, for instance, before yesterday's summit was one of the main point of sort of concern, whether the two leaders were going to say something on that. But yesterday, Erdogan remarks on Israel in the joint press conference were softer than usual. And this signals us something that I think it's again very interesting, and it goes back into the framework in which they decided to sort of hold this government summit, which was like, let's try to avoid any sort of tension. So noi mamolu, like very low rhetoric on Israel and what's happening in Israel against the Palestinians, and let's try to keep it to an economic and strategic level. So yes, this is a sort of a point in which Italy and Turkey, they fundamentally do not sort of align when it comes to that. But again, we know very well that Turkey's foreign policy towards Israel is mainly based on rhetoric and narrative, like trade kept on flowing very much, even though officially they said it stopped. And Turkey basically, other than sort of welcoming some few hundreds of Palestinians, couldn't do much more. The thing that aligned them, and I'll leave it at that, is that both countries, they do support the Gulf countries' plan, the Arabic countries' plan to rebuild Gaza and the two-state solutions. So I think they found that way to support like a third-party idea that doesn't put them in a sort of a confrontational perspective.
Samuele, do you know if there's any Italian interest in Syria, humanitarian, financial, company?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's an interest for Italy to prevent illegal migration, which actually saw that when it was massive towards the European doors, coming mostly from Syria in big numbers, right? And so that's the priority also that Italian Foreign Ministry Tajani highlighted when he paid visit and when he was talking or when he was questioned about Syria. So that's the first priority for Italy, and in that sense, Turkey has already shown proved to be a fundamental ally, not just for Italy but for the whole European Union. When we saw the deal right between the European Union and Turkey, and the second way the two countries can cooperate, or at least the venue in which Italy has interest in Syria, is also the post-conflict reconstruction, because Turkish companies were quite happy when Turkey showcased to have the upper end, right, through its diplomatic ties with the new Syrian government. They were quite happy about the possibilities that they have to cooperate with other international companies, with the EU funds, or either UN-funded projects to rebuild Syria, basically, because Syria is in need of facilities for 90% of the territory, right? And so also Italian companies have shown in other post-conflict areas like the Balkans we were mentioning, for example, to have the capability, the access, and let's say the expertise also to operate in such environments. So in that sense, probably not part of a bilateral framework, but more of a multinational or multilateral UN-based operation. The two countries could also operate in that sense in Syria, I would say. But of course, Syria is much more of a pressing issue for Turkey for security reasons, the northeast of Syria, the Kurdish issue, and all the things that our listeners already know. For Italy, is more a taboo, probably mentioning about the Kurdish issue because of the positions of European countries and the US policy on that.
Let me add briefly, like lots of the reconstruction, of course, in Syria will pass through whether the US will decide to lift the sanctions or not. Because if the US will not lift the sanctions, it will be very hard for any company, Turkey as well, to participate and to basically start a reconstruction of the country. So lots will pass through that, but there is definitely a willingness to cooperate in that scenario, for sure.
Yeah, and to encapsulate everything we've been talking about, I want to do some forward-looking projections, not necessarily predictions, but where's the road heading if we look at Italian and Turkish cooperation in various fields and defense? What do you think the implications are for the European Union and the region? What do you see ahead, basically? Where's this going?
So I'll try to be brief. I think there are a few factors that we need to keep into considerations, and the first one is the future of the Turkish government, which we are always discussing. I mean, like, what will be the future of the Turkish government after 2028? Will Erdogan be able to candidate himself again? Like, there are these variables, and I would very much sort of warn to shortcuts to any answers related to this, because there are, to my understanding, too many variables on the table that needs to be kept into considerations to be able to predict something. It's very hard. And so that is definitely one factor, for instance, because as we've been saying, quite a lot passes through leadership diplomacy in these times. So one of the things that we will need to look at is who will take power in Italy and Turkey in the next years. I mean, let's try not to look just, to next year, but in the next 10 years. So this is one factor. On the other hand, we've seen that, as Samuele was mentioning, Turkish-Italian relations have been able to go on regardless of their leadership, and this will definitely continue. I do expect somehow, in a way or in another, the defense deals to expand, because there is a fertile ground for it at the moment, and not just because it's related to build weapons and to produce weapons, but because there is a deep economic interest in doing that. And Leonardo and Baykar are two giants of the Turkish and Italian economies. So having found a way to cooperate between public-private partnership, I do think that they will keep on going on that. Like we've seen Cingolani's words, who is the CEO of Leonardo, giving an interview to Anadolu agency and advertising the defense deal in a way that has never been done in the Italian history, like to my understanding, basically. So this is also very interesting, and I think that will continue. At the European level, and then I leave it to Samuele for that, I think we should look to what extent this era of bilateral deals at the expense of multilateral deals, multilateral cooperation, will be able to be institutionalized at the European level. So what do I mean? I mean that we will need to look for, like, what if there are, not to waste resources in a way, because okay, now there is Italy Turkey cooperation, but then there will be Germany Turkey cooperation, then maybe some other countries will come up with other different, like, joint venture or defense cooperation. So that would sort of put Europe in a very difficult situation to, like, institutionalize the partnership and try to make it sustainable in the long term. On the other hand, and I leave it at that, domestic political developments in Turkey, I do believe we need to watch them carefully, because it's not just related to Turkey and to the future of the opposition in Turkey and to the democratic backsliding that is happening in Turkey, but what happens in Turkey directly affects, in the long term, the European security, in my understanding.
Yeah, this is perfect to also demonstrate the latest developments, I would say. And I would start mentioning a case, and then I will build on that my conclusions. The case is the case of the German government blocking the deal that they already made.
Reportedly, I learned new things about this today. It's not clear if that actually happened, according to reports.
Yeah, exactly. And this actually adds value to what I was saying, because, for example, we had Imamoglu himself being very vocal against this decision by the German government, because he warned them on the fact that, well, this is fundamental for Turkish national interest, and it's something that should go beyond leaders and beyond political cleavages. And this is quite telling about what Riccardo was mentioning, the need of creating a new framework that would allow to set the stage for long-term sustainable deals in a way that Turkey is integrated in certain aspects, but in a way, and here it's what we were also writing in our paper. I think we should also go beyond Turkey's membership candidacy to the European Union, because that is one thing. But if we are purely talking about defense, in the end, we're talking about a pressing issue, because the war in Ukraine hasn't stopped yet. It's still ongoing. The turmoil we have in the Middle East, the spillover effect towards the whole Mediterranean region is still there. We don't really know what will happen in the US, what will be the status of transatlantic relations. So, given this framework, in the end, we have to think about a new way, a new framework in which Turkey can be integrated in a credible way that is credible both for the EU, if the EU wants to be, on the one side, a geopolitical actor, wants a wannabe geopolitical actor, but if it also wants to maintain its value-based policies, right, its credibility in that. And also, we're talking about the credibility of Turkey in terms of what Riccardo was mentioning, the democratic backsliding. And so, for that, I think there are still many cleavages. And let's not forget also the veto power that, at the current status of the security architecture of the EU and all the framework we have, all these countries with veto power in the end could easily stop anything, even before any real concrete discussion about Turkey's inclusion into such a framework.
Yeah. And Giovanni asked a question about Kurds and rightly pointed out we haven't really addressed Kurds, which gives me the opportunity to point out that Bologna, the city in Italy, gave citizenship to Öcalan recently. And after some research, Riccardo understood that many municipalities in Italy have done this. So you have some leftists, sympathizers for the Kurdish cause in Italy. Where does that factor into relations? It seems like it doesn't factor into like the presidential relations, right? But how would you classify the Kurdish issue in Italian-Turkish relations?
So, thank you for the question, first of all. It is definitely an important topic, but as Diego was saying, it doesn't really have a place in the strategic bilateral cooperation framework that we've been talking about today. So, the support for the Kurdish issue, which is very much misunderstood in Italy, because the idea is to equate Kurds with the YPG, and only to that, not to the broader Kurdish cause, which encompasses 4 states and has a much broader history. But the main understanding in Italy related to the Kurds is related to the YPG and to the SDF. So Italian parties historically supported the Kurdish cause. I mean, Öcalan was also hosted in Italy for a while before he went to Kenya, and then it was captured by the Turkish intelligence services. So there is this tradition for the left to support the Kurdish cause. Like before Öcalan was giving honorary citizenship, there was also an important conference in Bologna in which Pervin Buldan, an important member of the DEM party, participated. And there are some sort of like networks, Kurdish networks in Italy, which are pretty powerful in their niche, I would say. But it is mainly related, and you can see this whenever you go to Italy or in Bologna, like walls are full of things written in favor of the YPG, which are not portrayed as terrorists as they are in Turkey and somewhere, and I mean in the US, of course, I mean in a different way they are conceived. But in Italy, they are not sort of at all perceived as terrorists, so they do not see them as related to the PKK as the Turkish government does. And interestingly, there were some cases of Italian foreign fighters that went in Rojava to fight alongside the YPG against ISIS, that then came back to Italy and, of course, were put under surveillance by the Italian justice system. Because, I mean, it was very hard to understand their status. There is no actually clear regulation on that. You participated into a foreign war, then you go back to your own country. I mean, that's a very complicated issue. And that sparked quite a lot of protest. So, yeah, I mean, there is a support in Italy for the Kurdish cause, historically coming from the left parties. There is a network of support, mainly limited to the YPG. So not taking into consideration the broad history. And of course, like when you ask to people in Italy, most people would say that the PKK and the YPG are the same things. Like, I mean, there is basically not a clear understanding on this. But it does not factor into the broader framework of the relation at all.
Samuele, anything to add on Kurds?
Just one thing that also Italian government now, but not just now, even before Meloni, is of course aware of the fact that whenever you mention anything about the Kurds, you are opening a Pandora vase, right? And in the end, it would prevent anything at the highest level or related to the national interest to happen and to take a good shape, and also it could alienate some companies or owners of companies that do not share those kind of visions about such a sensitive topic. And it's also in line with the fact that basically pragmatism in the way that Meloni conceives it basically allows to bypass any discussion about things that are mostly related to domestic affairs, values, human rights. Not saying they're not important, not saying Meloni does not give importance himself to this, but it's not important for her political constituency and not even for the way she's doing foreign policy, basically.
Yeah, so if there's no other questions, I'll wrap up and say thank you very much to everybody that joined, and also to Riccardo and Samuele. I highly recommend checking out their podcast. It's called Cose Turche News. It's on Spotify and anywhere you can find podcasts. It's the best Italian language source on Turkish news.
And the only one.
And the only one. Support Cose Turche News if you want to keep having Cose Turche News, because we support independent media here at Turkey Recap. I'll try to post this online as soon as I get it. And it should be, this conversation should be available shortly. I think I've fixed the tech issues we experienced in the past. So if you missed the beginning, please come back to turkeyrecap.com and check out this conversation from the beginning. Thank you again, and let's see what happens next.
Thank you very much, Diego. It was a real pleasure to discuss these issues with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Have a good day. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Görüşürüz.